Hello everyone, this is Andrea. I'm really glad that you're here today. This is Love and Philosophy, where we try to look at the patterns that connect. We try to learn to hold the paradox, find ways of new navigability between all these different disciplines and fields and interests. And today, in that sense, we're talking about feelings and what it means for cognition with Mark Solms, who is a South African psychoanalyst and a neuropsychologist. He's known in the neuroscience world for his discovery relative to the brain mechanisms of dreaming, which, as he tells us here, was, believe it or not, something people didn't dare to even study for a while in neuroscience because dreaming seems to be too subjective and too connected to, for example, something like the work of Sigmund Freud. But why has it been so hard for us to have a look at our own inner feelings and subjective experience when it comes to the harder sciences? That's a question that gets asked a lot on this podcast in different ways. There's a lot of conversations I've had that I haven't posted yet. They're coming soon, like one I had with Evan Thompson about the blind spot. The point is that a lot of people, a lot of very smart and successful people like Mark have been trying to include the subjective point of view in science for a long time. And we discuss it here through his own personal experience that he had with his family, a traumatic experience he had in South Africa that as a little boy made him want to know what consciousness was. In fact, he almost had to answer this question. It was a way he got himself out of depression after this event happened in his life that we talk about here. And it really did become his career to try to understand what consciousness is, what it means to be sentient, and in so doing to not pretend that the world is not a source of wonder and that our feeling actually matters. And our subjective experience, our lived phenomenology is the word we use often, really does matter for everything, including our science. And the way he's tried to sort of hold this paradox and get beyond this dichotomy is through this idea of feeling and bringing feeling back into neuroscience, I guess you could say, at least in the form of being able to talk about it as root or even raw consciousness. That consciousness arises from physical laws and that emotions actually can be placed at the center of our conscious or mental life. His book, The Hidden Spring, A Journey to the Source of Consciousness, is the foundation for this talk. We had to do it very quickly. We have a part 2, which we'll do soon. But this is just part 1, and we just let it flow. It's a good introduction of, first of all, how much feeling matters to us and how early it matters in our life and how it really does sort of guide us in a way that Mark shows in his book is like homeostasis. If you think of the body in the world moving through its encounter, our feeling is almost like a gauge helping us stay within the parameters of health or move towards better parameters. Not that it always works perfectly, but any kind of creature, even a fish, is moving through these parameters of feeling in a very basic level. And we can think of that as consciousness or cognition, which aren't the same things. I go into that a lot in other areas, so I won't go into it here. But the point is just, the broad point is we are in the world, we're trying to find our way, and feeling it's a key way for us to monitor our own needs and desires relative to what we find ourselves moving within and as, and all that we're becoming. And so that is a subjective point of view, and trying to understand it scientifically is what Mark has been doing. He has kind of held this paradox of being a trained neuroscientist and a trained psychoanalyst, and those don't always fit so well together in the communities that hold them, but Mark's really shown a way to move past that dichotomy. And this conversation today is towards starting to unpack that. It is itself kind of an expression of the raw feeling and of getting to this very interesting idea, I think, of understanding that what we think of as thinking is itself coming from that spring of feeling. So it too is a way that we maintain our homeostasis, that we steer, to think of my conversation with Max Bennett, the way we sort of steer through the world and all these different landscapes has to do with our feeling that helps us monitor and stay within certain parameters. And thinking is not discontinuous from that. Thinking is itself a homeostatic mechanism, so to speak. This is a very general summary, and I really recommend the book if you want to go very deeply into it and think it through. And also, I'll unpack more of these ideas with Mark when we talk the second time, which is coming up. So send me any questions you might have or any particular things you'd really like for us to explore together. Just to say a little bit about Mark, because there's so many things that one could say. He's a South African psychoanalyst and neuropsychologist. He's the chair of neuropsychology at the University of Cape Town. He's started Neuropsychoanalysis, the journal. I think he co-founded it, or he was the founding editor. He also founded the International Psychoanalyst Society, and he's the director of the Neuropsychoanalysis Foundation. I'm sorry, I can't say that right. The Neuropsychoanalysis Foundation in New York. To be honest, his credentials go on and on and on. He also brings in Sigmund Freud and Freud's work, and Freud actually was a neuroscientist at the beginning of his career. So that's an interesting story too, in rethinking Freud, which is something Mark Solms also does. But I've already rambled on too long. The main point is that think of feeling as a source of consciousness and begin to unpack that, and it's a very interesting thread. And I'd love to hear what you think about it. So I'm really glad you're here. I hope you enjoy this, and let me know what questions you might have for Mark. Okay, bye. Thank you for doing this today.
Pleasure's mine.
Today we're going to talk mostly about hidden spring, but to get into that and issues related to it, I wonder if you could start the way you start the book, the beginning of your journey, what I think of almost as a change in your own consciousness, so to speak, and feeling.
Yes. So the story you're asking me to tell is really, I'm fairly certain, the origins of my interest in the brain, which is an event that occurred when I was just going on 5 years old. I was 4. My older brother named Lee and I were playing in a yacht clubhouse while our parents were yachting, and my brother and some pals of his clambered up onto the roof, and he tripped at the high end of the roof and fell quite some distance, about 3 floors, and landed on his head on the paving stones below, and suffered a fractured skull and a brain hemorrhage. We were in a small town. He was flown, bizarrely, he was flown to the hospital that I now work in Cape Town, and in fact was treated in the very building where my office is now, which was and partially still is where the Department of Neurosurgery is situated. And he was well looked after there, in the sense that his life was saved, and he returned back to our little village, looking the same, apart from the fact that he was wearing a helmet to protect his fractured skull. But I say he looked the same because that was in sharp contrast to the fact that he was not the same person. He was really utterly changed. And I found it, you must remember, I was very little at the time. I found it absolutely incomprehensible. Who's this guy? Where's my brother? How can he come back in the same body but be a different person?
Do you remember when that struck you? In the book you talk a little bit about some games you used to play, and he sort of didn't play the game the same way.
I actually have even a fragmentary memory of the incident itself, when he fell, and I remember him. I think it's a semantic memory that he was wearing a helmet. I don't have a picture in my mind of him wearing the helmet. But yes, what I remember is these sorts of things that you mentioned. We were actually good friends, although he was older than me, 2 years older than me. We played a lot together, And one incident that I do literally remember is playing this game that we used to play. Our father was in the mining game. He worked for a company called De Beers, a diamond mining company. And the diamonds in the area that we lived in were alluvial, which means they're not buried in the rocks of the earth. They lie loose in the sand and desert sand. And my father took us to see these mining operations, which were truly impressive. These massive earth-moving machines picking up all the sand, which was then processed for diamonds.
Sounds
And so my brother
cinematic
and I,
almost.
yes,
Sounds
my
very
brother and
magical in
I,
a way as a kid.
yes, indeed, it was a very strange place to grow up in. I mean, there are all sorts of things I could tell you about. It was really a very strange place. But I was obviously terribly impressed by what I saw. And so my brother and I played that game. We had little toy earth moving machines, and we were playing at mining. That's what we were doing. And the scene that I remember was playing that game with him after his accident and realizing that he was not playing the game in the way that we used to, which was a symbolic game. These things, what we were doing was mining. Symbolically. I mean, it's not real mining, it's play mining. But for my brother now, the game had become digging holes. What we were doing was digging a hole. And I thought, what the hell?
Digging holes. That must have been shocking for you because we have to remember you're just like 5. And
yes.
well, I'll share something with you because I wonder if what this was like for you. But my brother is like about 3 years younger than me. And I remember his kind of entrance into my life as of a kind of realizing that I'm conscious or something because we had this kind of, I don't know, there was a reflection or something. It's when I start remembering things very easily, and I was about the age of you, and so I just wonder what it was like as a little kid to kind of have to realize that your brother isn't in the imagination state anymore. Did it make you become aware that there was an imagination state? Because this is kind of a heavy thing to go through at that age, but it's also exactly the age, at least in my experience, when you do start to think of yourself as a self and remember and so on.
Well, let me just tell you one or two other things, and then I'll be able to better address the question you're putting to me. That's the one incident I remember, but there was also the fact that he lost his developmental milestones. So, for example, he was no longer continent. And this is an embarrassment to a child, to not have bowel control and bladder control. And so this was part of what then became a bigger realization that I had overtaken him, developmentally, so that he was now behind me, not only in terms of those kinds of milestones, but also in terms of his intellect, that there were things he couldn't do cognitively that I could do, and it had previously been the opposite. So I wouldn't say I became aware in the philosophical sense that you evidently did, of selfhood. But what I did become aware of is another philosophical problem, which is the mind-body problem. I became aware of the fact that somehow my brother, the person that I had known, was bound up with this bodily organ that had been damaged in him. And so I became aware that there's this mysterious connection between personality or personhood, or mind and brain. And I also remember realizing, in fact, I remember looking at an encyclopedia where there was it was sort of plates. They were transparent plates, and the first page was the skin, and then you peeled that back, and there you saw the musculoskeletal system, and then you peeled that back, and then you saw the soft tissues. And in the case of the head, of course, you saw the brain on that plate. So I remember looking at this and thinking and feeling, I too have a skull, and inside this skull, I too must have a brain. And if my brain were damaged, as my brother's was, then I too would change as a person. And And that rapidly led on to, when I say rapidly, I don't know how rapidly, but certainly still, in childhood, I remember that this led to a first confrontation with mortality. The realization that the flesh is mortal, and that if I am my body, and my body dies and rots one day, what does that mean for me? Where will I go?
Yeah.
If I am my brain, and my brain dissipates, then do I dissipate too? And came to the conclusion that yes, surely I do. I say this because my parents sent me to Sunday school, where I was learning a very different story from Christian teachers. And so I started to realize that actually this is not true. I am my body, and so I'm not going to survive beyond my biological existence. And that in turn, I mean, apart from the loss of my brother and all kinds of other things, because it was really a very complicated situation in our family, in the wake of all the difficulties that he now had. So for those reasons, and also for this existential reason, I became very depressed. I have no doubt that I was literally, psychiatrically depressed, because I can remember that very vividly too. I can remember, for example, in the morning before going to school, not being able to put my shoes on. It just felt like too much of an effort. It felt, what's the point? What's the point of going to school? Everything's going to end in nothingness. There's no point in doing anything in your entire life, because it'll all just come to nothing. No matter how happy or successful you are, in the end, it's all taken away for eternity. I remember thinking that, and then sometime later, I think only in adolescence, I remember coming to the solution to that sort of nihilistic despair. The solution I came to, in terms of there's no point in doing anything. The solution I came to was, well, the one thing that is worth doing under these circumstances is to try to understand what sentient being is. And I think that attached to that, which I still believe is true, but attached to that was also, I think, the wishful fantasy that maybe, if I can really understand what being is, what we would now call consciousness, what it is, then maybe I'll find some solution to this conclusion, this inevitability of it disappearing with your body at death. I think I still harbored the hope that maybe if I really understand what sentient being is, that I'll find some way of being able to cling to possessing it beyond my death.
Gosh, it's a really remarkable story that you were feeling all of that as a kid. But just that time period is already so potent. And I was thinking as I was reading it that I don't even remember when I realized there was a brain. Like you kind of learn that stuff slowly usually. And also, of course, like having the religious things given to you, and then you sort of slowly start to question what's real and not. But it sounds like it all hit you in a really heavy way. But like two things. One, you already started looking in books to try to find the answer, looking for pictures, and that's interesting to me. And also that you called it the mind-body problem, but at that age, was it a problem then, or was it more that you realized that the body and the mind are one thing, sort of, that wasn't different, like your brother's body changed and his self changed, and so that made those religious stories and the other things not make sense? I know, of course, you weren't thinking about all of this in depth at that age, but
I think that we generally underestimate what kinds of problems children think about. But I do agree that in my case, it was, I don't think I would have thought about those things at that age if it wasn't for what had happened to my brother. But, I was learning in Sunday school about the soul, and the soul that survives after death is kind of me, So there I saw my brother's self had changed. So his soul, as it were, had changed. And this clearly was therefore thoroughly attached to his body. And then, all the other things that we just spoke about. Another thing that I think was formative arising out of all of this was that it was a source of pain in my family, especially for my brother, but guilty feelings arose in me whenever I did well at school, because he did very badly. He had great difficulty getting through even his first grade at school. And no, in fact, he repeated it. He didn't get through it. And I was a clever kid, so yeah. I did well. And every time I did well, it was a problem. And it was a real sort of dilemma for me of how do I deal with this? Because I was ambitious and wanted to do well, but at the same time, it was clearly a source of distress to my brother and in a different sort of way for my parents. I don't know where my, I don't think that I had more ambition and sort of epistemophilic drive than the average kid. I think I was bright, but I think that the solution that I came to, and this was not consciously, I don't remember deliberating on the point, but I think that I came to a compromise sort of pre-consciously, without being aware of it, that if I go into the field that I then did go into later, when I went to university, I studied neuroscience, and in particular, that branch of neuroscience called neuropsychology, which deals with the relationship between brain and mind. But I always was determined to be not only a scientist, but also a clinician. And I think that's the solution. The solution to the conflict between my ambition and my guilt was, if I excel in a field where I'm helping people like my brother, then it's permissible.
I hadn't really thought about the clinician part, because it's also related to the medical part, which that kind of saved your brother, even though he was a bit of a different brother. So that starts to make sense. So at some point you ended up actually trying to study the brain and what consciousness is. And it sounds like that you were trying to understand that subjectivity, of how that subjectivity changes, or consciousness, and still maybe thinking it was bodily. If you study the body, you're also going to study that. But then when you actually began studying it, you found it disappointing that those things actually had been separated and extracted in a way that felt dissatisfying.
Very much so. Again, I think, I said a moment ago that we underestimate children's intellects. I think that this thing that happened to me, I think it also applies to many people who come into my field, that they have a sense of wonder, and mystery about, how on earth does it happen that, that subjective being arises somehow from, the physiological activities of a bodily organ. But that sense of mystery was not encouraged. So once I got to university and started probing these questions, I rapidly became aware that these were not the sorts of questions you were supposed to be interested in if you wanted to be a proper scientist. And I remember one professor in particular literally saying to me, "Don't ask questions like that. It's bad for your career." And I think that when I say I'm sure I wasn't alone in that respect, I think we get it beaten out of us. This my naive understanding as I started my studies was that the mind is, something like the person, the being, the thing that the subjective, immaterial being of my brother, of his personality. I thought, this is what we mean by mind. So neuropsychology, that's what we're going to study. We're going to study things like selfhood and sentience and where does it all come from and what is it all for? And as I said, I was rapidly dissuaded from being interested in these sorts of things. And I'm talking about the early 1980s. Yeah. I mean, we'd barely emerged from behaviorism then.
Yeah. But I guess it's interesting because you really had these questions and you were trying to understand, and people were embarrassed by the subject matter, but the subject matter is itself really the most important thing in a way. I'm always talking about holding the paradox, and I feel like I wonder how you were doing that. People were telling you not to ask the questions you were asking, but you kept asking them anyway, right?
Yes, indeed. And I have continued to ask them all my life. Sort of make clear what was so frustrating and disappointing is that what my professors considered to be the mind was the sort of abstract functional, the functions of the brain were studied in exactly the same way as you might study the function of digestion or the function of respiration. You know, that it's that's not a mind. You know, that's a mechanistic understanding of how this organ works. But where is the subjectivity in all of this? You know, how does it come about? That was what was completely excluded. So the one and only aspect of consciousness that was respectable to study those days was the sleep-waking cycle. In the late 40s, Magoon and Maruzzi had identified these upper brainstem structures which underpin wakefulness, and so wakefulness was and its waxing and waning was a respectable topic. So I decided I'm going to study that, brain mechanisms of sleep and wakefulness, and in particular, I was interested in the wakefulness that occurs while we're asleep. In other words, dreaming. You know, that consciousness punctuates the unconsciousness of sleep, and so that was a kind of a sort of a trick, as a way of being able to study something subjective, something obviously mental in the sense that I understood the word. And so it was whilst I was doing that research, which was in fact my doctoral research, that was there were two things that happened. The first one was that I made some fortunate discoveries. I mean, it really was just good luck.
You noticed something that seems obvious in retrospect, but the people weren't actually studying what happens to dreams when the brain is damaged. I mean, in retrospect, this seems obvious, but actually it's quite a thing to notice, I guess.
It is really quite remarkable. And I think that it speaks again to the avoidance of studying the subjective side of mental life, or the subjective side of this bodily organ. That we studied REM sleep and so on, but we didn't study dreaming. It's a kind of a questionable topic to be dabbling in, because you can't see the dream. You have to get a subjective report from the patient. And that's what I did. And it is, I say, remarkable that nobody had done it before, but that's why they hadn't done it before, is I started to systematically examine the changes that occurred in dreams in a very large sample of patients, hundreds of patients, and discovered that there are systematic changes in the reported experience of dreams. And the most important observation was that a certain group of patients with damage to the white matter of what's called the ventromedial quadrant of the frontal lobes, that these patients stop dreaming completely. They continue to have REM sleep, but they don't dream. And now the really important thing about that observation, as it gradually unfolded, I'm giving a sort of a concertinaed account of it, but it gradually became apparent on the basis not only of where the damage was, but then other studies that I did trying to determine why should damage there lead to a loss of dreaming. It became clear from those other studies that the part of that white tissue that is responsible for generating dreams, if I can put it so in such an awkward way, is what's called the mesocortical mesolimbic dopamine system. Now, that is generally known as the brain reward system. Panksepp calls it the seeking system, and Berridge calls it the wanting system. So this is clearly, a sort of a desire system. And I thought, oh my God, this sounds like Freud. My only encounters with Freud up until then were, the kinds of crass things that scientists, especially neuroscientists, they say, oh, that's just rubbish. And,
Freud, avoid it. A bit
yes,
like
but,
avoid the questions that you want to ask, avoid
yes.
Freud. Yeah.
So
there's a similar theme there.
Yeah, that made me interested. Because I had this sort of layperson's understanding that Freud thought that dreams were wishful. So I attended a seminar. Bizarrely, the seminar was taught by a professor of comparative literature. It was an open seminar. Any graduate student could go to it. And he was teaching Freud's interpretation of dreams. And so
you could only teach Freud in a literature class, I guess.
Yes, that's certainly how it became. By the 80s, it was like that. I think it's even more so now. This chap, this professor of comparative literature, he was really very good, and he gave a very comprehensive account of Freud's interpretation of dreams. And then he said that you can't understand the theory in that book of Freud's if you don't acquaint yourself also with something he wrote 5 years earlier in 1895. He wrote something that's come to be known as the Project for a Scientific Psychology, which was, while he was still a neuroscientist, Freud was trying to imagine, what's going on in the brain that could produce the kinds of mental phenomena that he was observing clinically in patients which are now called patients with functional neurological disorders. Those days it was called hysteria. And so I was just amazed. I was amazed to discover that Freud was a neuroscientist.
I think most people would still be today, right? To think that Freud was a neuroscientist.
Yes.
First and foremost.
Yes. So that kind of gave me not permission, but it made me feel, well, if he's actually one of us, Freud was a proper scientist and he was a neuroscientist, and so that I remember reading his book on aphasia, Freud's book on aphasia, which was written in 1891, and it was really remarkably good neuropsychology, and so one thing led to another, and I then decided to train as a psychoanalyst, much to the horror of my professors and colleagues. One of my colleagues said to me, "That's like an astronomer studying astrology."
Yeah, why do you think people are so, what's the word? I don't know, like turned off by these things that are so important to us? I mean, I don't mean to blame people because it's hard. I was thinking about your parents, for example, and that what they went through was very hard. So it was hard for them to just look at it and confront it and talk about it and so on. And I feel like that's not completely discontinuous from once we get into academia, that the things that matter most or that seem the most real to us we're embarrassed by somehow, or we can't talk about them academically, like our own subjective experience in an academic context.
I have to just clarify that my parents, their difficulty in talking about what had happened to my brother, I don't think it had to do with the same sorts of things as we're talking about now. I think it was just too painful, and I think they felt terribly guilty about what had happened to him, and it was just a thing that it was a topic we avoided for those sorts of reasons. While I'm at it, I know I'm speaking too much, but while I'm at it, I must just say, I am grateful to my father for allowing me to stop going to Sunday school. He said to me, your mother believes in all of that. I don't, so it's up to you. And that was a real revelation, was that, oh, so you can make up your own mind about these sorts of things. That I think was a good thing that he did.
Oh, that's wonderful. And I don't mean to suggest it's the same thing, but these are humans, right, telling you this, who've had their own experiences and their own growing up. And I think we've all had this where as a kid, you realize there's certain places that are just too hard to go. Yes. And I don't mean that's the same in academia, but for me, I've felt it in a similar way, even in myself, that it's like almost like more than we can handle. I know in science, it can become more about, you need to be able to prove it with data and experiments and so on. But
Yeah.
I guess what I'm trying to get at is that through line of something like feeling, or something like the most basic kind of stuff that through layers and layers of all of this, we come to not really think of it anymore as essential and important in the way that it really is in those situations that form us, like that one in your life.
Yeah. Well, I'm very glad that I never gave up my interest in these scientifically embarrassing questions. And I think that's the source of it. I mean, you're right. It's feeling, and the feeling in question here is the embarrassing fact that the mind is something subjective. That's just the absolute ground zero fact about the mind, is that it is something subjective, and secondly, it exists. It's part of nature. So, sorry, there's a part of nature that's subjective. And science, of course, aspires to objectivity. So there you have the problem. The mind is an embarrassment to science. And so the history of psychology, which ironically means science of the mind, in the 20th century, I mentioned behaviorism a moment ago. That was the way in which it was dealt with, was literally you must exclude the mind from the science of the mind, and you must only study its external manifestations in the form of behaviors. And the external stimuli, as they called it, that triggered these behavioral responses. And they literally, airbrushed the mind not only out of science, but out of the science of the mind.
Yeah, it's very, very strange, isn't it? I mean,
yeah.
don't see what is the most important, and then you kind of turn it into something that seems to be objective and not based on the very thing that started it all and that you're trying to understand.
In the case of behaviorism, it began as a methodological or epistemological stance, that because you can't study subjective things objectively, we will exclude them from study. But then it became a sort of ontological position, and they started to say that it literally doesn't exist. I mean, that's even worse. Skinner infamously said, the famous behaviorist B.F. Skinner, he said, emotions, which he put in scare quotes, he said, emotions are an excellent example of the fictitious explanations we use to account for behavior. I mean,
Incredible. But I also don't want to be too hard on them, because I think that's why I was trying to link it to something personal, because it comes, I feel like there's a way in which we started building all these instruments and technologies, and we started thinking that only when you have something that all of us can kind of examine through one of those technologies together, then it can be legitimate or something like that. And I don't know, maybe you don't think it's connected, but I do think it's too hard to think about your own emotions and your own feelings and your own, all of these things through that lens. So it's better to just kind of bracket all of that as just your own stuff. It needs to almost be like a sterile place that's not connected to your personality or something, because it feels too embarrassing or close.
Freud said in a letter to Einstein that the mind is like the esophagus. Everything must flow only in one direction. So in the case of the mind, he means we must only look outwards, and it causes a feeling of revulsion if we reverse the direction of flow and look inwards.
And weirdly, that looking inwards kind of ends up being the moments that matter the most in a life. But this, I think, points to this looking for the spring in the wrong place, which is a big part of the book, the cortical kind of model, because I think that's connected to what we're saying here, a certain way of thinking about science or results or data or whatever, that also resulted in a way of thinking about consciousness or cognition in a very general cartoonish sense. It became that whatever is consciousness or cognition that can be studied in the way we've been talking about probably is connected to what is called the cortex in the brain, right?
Well, the reason that we became so enamored with the cortex is, I suppose, first and foremost, because it's our evolutionary pride and joy. We humans have got such. Yeah. But beyond that, it's also the obvious place to start to look for a physiological and anatomical account of consciousness, because all the sensory end organs project to the cortex. And there's a dedicated zone in the cortex for each one of the special senses. And if that zone is damaged, you lose the conscious awareness that goes with that sensory modality.
Like that's where we're located. Even in your research with the dream, right? That's where you were looking, and you seem to have found it there.
Yeah. No, I had no reason to question that. What shall I call it? Prejudice. That cortex and consciousness are bound up with each other. Now, the mistake or the I don't know if I should call it a mistake so much as the weakness in that way of thinking is that it assumes that consciousness has to do with something coming in from the outside. That consciousness flows in with our perception. And so then again, we are talking about something that's about objects, something that's about, these are the objects of consciousness, things that you see, things that you hear. Whereas the essence, in my view, the fundamental form of consciousness is just feeling. That's something that comes from within. So the idea that consciousness consists in 5 qualities that coincide with the 5 perceptual modalities leaves out of account feeling, which is not a perception in the sense of a perception of a thing. You could say, in a sense, it's a perception of your own being. And this illustrates what I mean when I say that it's something that comes from within. But when you start to look into the brain mechanisms which generate feeling, then you find that it is the innermost core of the brain stem, which also is the part of the brain that sustains wakefulness. I mean, the whole sort of the state of being conscious is generated endogenously from within. You have to, first of all, have a subject of consciousness before that subject can become aware of its objects of consciousness.
But it gets completely lost. So, like, just to link it to your research, people should know that was a really big discovery, actually, with understanding that REM and dreams are dissociated or are the same. And there's a lot that you did there that's really, really very important. But you still were kind of locating it in this cortex, which I'm making kind of the metaphor of language-based understanding of thought or something, or this kind of scientific way in which we don't think feeling has anything to do with it, which is associated with more lower areas of the brain, like the brainstem. But as it turned out, someone pointed out to you that even though you'd found this in the cortex, and it's very important what you found and so forth, actually it originated system which is in the brainstem. So you were kind of forced to then rethink this in a way.
Yes. So it was known that REM sleep, and I know we're speaking overly simplistically here, so forgive me, it's for brevity. We knew at the time that I started those studies in the 1980s that REM sleep was, not to put too fine a point on it, generated by brainstem nuclei. And the whole view was, therefore, there's nothing mental going on here. This is just a sort of like something like a reflex, And so I was interested in the changes in the quality, the content, the phenomenology of dreams arising from damage to different parts of the brain. And I meant cortex. That's what I expected. I expected that, for example, as I mentioned a moment ago, the occipital cortex bound up with visual consciousness. If you have damage there and you lose visual consciousness, then surely you won't have visual dreams anymore. If you lose language cortex and you can't speak anymore, then surely in your dreams too, you will no longer be able to speak. That's the sort of thing I was hypothesizing. And what I found, as I told you, was that there was this white matter in the frontal lobes, and I linked it to frontal cortex. This has got to do with something in the frontal lobes, and I just assumed we were talking about something cortical. And then, as you say, a colleague of mine, Alan Brown, let me name him, from NIH, he said, but and also I was trying, sorry, I didn't make this clear. I was in doing this, I was drawing attention to the fact that REM sleep and dreaming are different things. REM sleep is generated in the brainstem, dreams are generated in the frontal lobes. And then it was this chap, Alan Brown, who pointed out to me that the fibers that I had identified, the fiber pathway, which is this mesocortical, mesolimbic dopamine system, it has its source cells, its origin, also in the brainstem. So we were back in the brainstem again. And then
right, which was the seat of feeling, right? So
yes.
Everything, I mean, we have to be a little cartoonish because we have 1 hour to speak, but let's just say that the cortex was associated with what we think of as consciousness in this way that is very legitimate. There is, as you were saying, everything connects up there, and as humans, there's all this research towards it. But now you were finding out that what we thought of as consciousness was actually connected to the brainstem, which has to do with feeling. We can even think of consciousness as feeling, as that raw feeling is already consciousness in a way. But just if we could cartoon it a little bit, how did that come that, oh, actually what I thought of was consciousness in the cortex is in the brainstem, and this is feeling, and we have to take feeling seriously in the way that you were already trying, but of course being told not to.
Yeah, so in a nutshell, in the upper brainstem, there are structures which very loosely we call the reticular activating system. And the word says it all. These nuclei activate the cortex. So you can't, although the cortex is the seat, as it were, of those various modalities of perceptual consciousness, if you have damage to the reticular activating system in the brainstem, then all the lights go out. So it's not one or another perceptual modality. The whole bang shoot disappears. So that indicates that that cortical consciousness is contingent upon brainstem arousal, brainstem activation. And then if you think about what I was saying about one of those arousal systems, the one that generates dreams, which, as I said, is generally known as the brain reward system, also known as the seeking system or the wanting system. This is a feeling system. It has to do with a particular quality of feeling, which in the case of the system we're talking about, it's the kind of exploratory interest, a kind of engagement with uncertainty, engagement with novelty, that kind of feeling. So what this shows, this one example, the same applies to all of these arousal systems coming from the reticular activating system, is that it's not just a light switch or a volume control, kind of like, switching on consciousness, which is somehow blank, and then, you have to populate the contents, and the actual qualitative stuff of consciousness comes from the outside. What this system is an example of the fact that these arousal systems, which are prerequisite for any form of consciousness, they have a content and a quality of their own, which is not perceptual, but rather affective. So these raw feeling states are generated by the very same structures that are prerequisite for any sort of consciousness. So you put those two and two together and you realize, okay, so the fundamental form of consciousness, it's sort of elemental prerequisite for any form of consciousness is feeling. And that does not flow in from the inside. It's I feel like this about that. It's a sort of feeling our way into our perceptions, rather than the perception, than the consciousness coming from outside. It comes from inside, and we kind of palpate it with feeling.
To try to link it to what we've been talking about, because we, like as a kid, when you come into the world, you have certain ways of dealing with that world. And then do you see this as a kind of continuity in terms of the way that spring does interact with the world? And I mean, you go into a lot of different models that we could talk here, but there's this kind of looping through the Markov blanket, so to speak, that's happening. And when we think about something like consciousness, you say it always has, its feeling is always conscious, but this gets a little confusing in terms of, like, where does this consciousness that we talk about now as if it's an awareness of our own consciousness come into play for you? And how does that relate to feeling and in your model, or in your way of really starting to almost bridge these cortical and brainstem notions of what consciousness really is?
Yeah. So the The way that I look on it, and for good reason, which I'll explain to you in a moment, is that first of all, selfhood is not reflective selfhood. It is just being. So it's just the feeling.
Is it just the body? Can we say that the body is it, or is there a layer to that for you?
Well, different parts of the body have different relationships with consciousness. So obviously, consciousness is more bound up with the brain than any other part of the body, and it's more bound up with this brainstem core that we're talking about than any other part of the brain. Do you know, in fact, I think I mentioned it in my book, that the smallest area of damage in the human brain that reliably produces coma is just 2 cubic millimeters in extent in a part of the reticular activating system called the parabrachial complex. So, you know, when I say that this is the font of consciousness, you know, this is where it all comes from. There's very little reason to doubt that. That when you stimulate these tissues, it generates raw feeling. When you manipulate the neurotransmitters that arise from these systems, you manipulate feeling states. So raw feelings, I mean, try and think fish rather than human. You know, it's just the fish just goes where the good feelings are. You know, that's where the right temperature is. That's where the food is. You know, that's where all the good stuff is, and so it goes there. It doesn't think I am a fish. And I'm trying to sustain my energy supplies. Therefore, it's just the feeling brings about a mind, a mind which is not mindful of itself, but just is sentient, just is, just there is something it is like to be it, and that's its mind. Then with cortex, you have the capacity, and especially with the development of language, with all of its abstract reasoning that it enables, then you can start thinking about your thoughts, or rather thinking about your feelings, which incidentally, to go back to where we were at the beginning of this conversation, it's what it's all for. It's what it's all about. It's what matters to us. You know, is how we feel. The reason that we do all of this learning and understanding of how the world works is because it assists us in our task of trying to feel better. In fact, it's the only reason that we eat and drink and all of that too. You know.
Yeah, we want to understand. I think the story that you start with illustrates it a lot in a way that you want to understand it, and you need motivation, you need a reason to keep going, and all those have been separated because they're too embarrassing to think of scientifically, but weirdly, they're also what created science. So I'm being metaphorical, but for the sake of time, but I feel like with coming back to the brainstem, for example, the way you do, and people are just going to have to read the book because there's a whole lot more than we can even touch on. But you definitely show that consciousness doesn't necessarily need the cortex, which doesn't mean the cortex isn't very important for a lot of forms of consciousness. But there's a way in which we can start to think of this differently. It's very hard, almost like holding the paradox. And similarly, you also show that a lot of what Freud was doing with the tools that he had at that time was trying to show that too, even maybe spelling that out in a different way. So how can we hold these things and not be embarrassed?
Yeah, well, Freud's great contribution was to do the opposite of what the behaviorists did. Rather than adjusting the objects to our methods, you adjust your methods to the object. So, you know, if the object that you're studying is a subject, you know, then you've got to find a way of investigating subjectivity, which is what Freud's method, for all of its faults, that was its great merit, you know, that its starting point was that we are dealing with the subjective experience of people, and therefore we have to investigate their first-person accounts of what it is that they're experiencing. You do that. I mean, I am now a psychoanalyst, have been for decades, so I can tell you from my own experience, both as a patient in psychoanalysis, which you have to do as part of your training, and also from my analyses of other fellow human beings, you very rapidly, when you start taking seriously what is it that makes us tick subjectively, you very rapidly discover, that it's all about feelings, that this is what matters to us, that it really is the governing principle of everything that drives the life of the mind. And so Freud observed that. It's kind of impossible not to observe that. And that led him to what I think was the most fundamental contribution that he made, beyond the mere decision that I'm going to explore subjectivity. It's part of nature. I'm sorry, I have to include it in science. The question of, well, where do these feelings come from, led Freud to the idea that fundamentally it has to do with the fact that we're embodied creatures. That if you think about the most rudimentary of feelings, I alluded to them a moment ago, things like hunger and thirst. I mean, these are feelings. And why? And they have an imperative quality. You try not eat for a few days, or you try to not drink, or you try to not sleep, or you try to not breathe. You very rapidly feel very powerful feelings. And so it's very clear where the feelings come from. They come from, it's a demand from the flesh. It's a demand that we have needs, and we have to satisfy those needs. And feelings tell us how well or badly we're doing in that respect. This is what they're for. So this was Freud's great insight, his first true discovery, and it's what he called drive theory. The idea that he defined drive. I can quote it literally. He said, drive is a measure of the demand made upon the mind for work by virtue of the connection between the mind and the body. And so that is the starting point of sentience. It's the starting point of mental being, of the body having a subjective aspect, a body coming to know its own state, is what feeling is.
That's a kind of minimizing of free energy you show in the book too.
Yes, well, that's a way of understanding it. So in the book, I try to understand, well, how does that work? And the fundamental mechanism is called homeostasis. Homeostasis is the most basic biological mechanism. It is what distinguishes living things from non-living things. That living things have needs. They have to occupy certain parameters. If they don't stay within their preferred states, they die. So like I was saying now about oxygen and water and temperature and sleep and so on. These are imperatives. We have to meet those needs, and homeostasis or feeling is an extended form of homeostasis, where bad feelings are moving away from where I need to be, and good feelings mean the opposite. I'm heading in the right direction. Feelings are a value system which reflects, or which perhaps I should say broadcasts to us, the basic value system of all biology, which is that it's good to survive and bad to die. This is the absolute bedrock of feeling. So once you recognize its homeostasis, then you have all kinds of tools at your disposal. One can explain homeostasis, for example, in ordinary mathematical models. Mechanistic physicalist account of homeostasis is not that difficult. And so what I was groping for in that book was trying to understand in this way, using the same tools as we use in all of natural science, trying to explain how feelings come about and what they do. I mean, this is something I cannot emphasize enough, that feelings have consequences. Feelings have causal power. You will never understand how the brain works if you don't understand that what it's doing is fundamentally determined by feelings. In other words, if you only take a a bodily perspective. In other words, if you only look at an external anatomy and physiology, and you don't recognize that this is somehow causally interdigitated with the subjective feeling states. They're not just epiphenomena. They're not just nice to have. They actually change what we do. And I mean, nothing could be more obvious in a sense. But so in that book, I'm trying to come up with I mean, when I say I'm trying to, I'm rather pleased with what I was able to, how far I was able to get with it, in terms of trying to account for feelings and therefore consciousness, using the same tools as we use in all of science.
Yeah, I think you show that, from my point of view, the free energy principle and active inverse and everything that you bring in, we have to be careful not to mistake the map and the territory and all of that. But in a way, it just shows that you can apply a similar statistical model to this pattern in a lot of different ways, including the pattern of understanding that the way that our feeling, or what we think of as consciousness as humans in the most kind of special way, could be a way of finding our homeostasis, or another level of that homeostatic process. Does that seem true for you? I mean, can you say that?
Deeply true. I think it's deeply true. Speaking about maps and territories, and bearing in mind, I know that we've got literally a minute to go, but the subjective perspective, in other words, the being of the mind, and the objective perspective, the organ of the mind, the connecting, what is, if these are just observational perspectives upon one and the same thing, then it asks it raises the question, well, then what is the underlying ontological stuff? And that's what I think we need: the language, the abstract language of statistical mechanics, things like the free energy principle. And as Galileo said, the book of nature is written in the language of mathematics. So it's trying to find something beyond these two appearances which can explain them both.